Everyone for joining us. I'm so glad to be here talking about No Mow May. That has really become quite a catchy phrase in Wisconsin the past few years. It is encouraging homeowners to allow their lawns to grow during May. So before we get into our discussion with our panelists, we want to provide some foundational information so we all have a really common understanding. And since we're going to be talking about pollinators today, let's start with a definition. A pollinator is any animal that visits flowering plants and transfers pollen from flower to flower. So while bees, especially honeybees, get a lot of attention and are very effective pollinators, we also rely on many insects such as moths and butterflies, flower flies, wasps, beetles, and more. And plus, here in Wisconsin, we have the ruby-throated hummingbird that helps pollinate flowers too. We really rely heavily on insect pollination throughout the world. Many plants grown for food, beverages, fibers, spices, medicine need to be pollinated by animals. Here in Wisconsin, crops such as apple and cranberry, cherry, green beans, cucumbers, other fruits and vegetables, the flowers and plants that you're growing at home, honey and beeswax, they all rely on pollinators. So let's dig in a little bit here. What is No Mow May and why was it started? The premise of No Mow May, or the No Mow May initiative, is to pause mowing during May to allow flowers to bloom in your lawn to help early season pollinators. So oftentimes these flowering plants are considered weeds in your lawn, and early spring is a time where the floral resources are often limited for pollinators. And it's important to note that this initiative was really focused in urban and suburban landscapes. No Mow May was first launched in 2019 by an organization based in the United Kingdom called Plant Life. A year later, residents of Appleton, Wisconsin, Appleton is an affiliate of Bee City, USA, they organize their own No Mow May. So a lot of times in those urban or even suburban landscapes, there's ordinances about your grass height and weed length, and the residents in Appleton convinced their city council to suspend those ordinances during May that year. And then over 400 homeowners participated. And this actually sparked a pretty nationwide movement, gaining interest and momentum throughout Wisconsin and the rest of the nation the past couple of years. More and more cities and townships are relaxing their grass height and weed ordinances during May. For here in the Midwest, in Wisconsin especially, May just works out for the time frame. In other parts of the states, it might be a No Mow April or something else, but here No Mow May works out just kind of because of timing. We also just want to make a quick note here that you might hear the term no mow grass or no mow grass seed or no mow mixes. That's not the same as the No Mow May initiative. No mow grass is a mix. You can purchase these mixtures, and it's just a mix of fine fescue species that grow slowly, and you don't need to mow them as often. However, you still do need to mow them depending on how tall you like your lawn. And these no mow or these fine fescue species are usually used in combinations with other designs in the landscape. They're not a replacement for your conventional lawn if you have a lot of recreation and a lot of traffic on a conventional lawn. And looking at No Mow May, does it actually support pollinators? And we've taken a look at some of that available research. I'm going to put a link to the Bee City website where some of that research is linked up and summarized. And the practice of No Mow May specifically impacting pollinator health and abundance hasn't yet been widely studied, but there has been some published research and citizen science efforts that have shown that plant and insect diversity increases when there is less frequent mowing. So more plants, more insects when there is less frequent mowing. So again, I'm going to link up things throughout the talk today, but Peggy, I will turn it back to you so we can get into that discussion with our panelists.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. Well, with that beginning, to get us all set, let's talk with our panelists. Today we have with us PJ Liesch, an extension entomology specialist and director of the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab. We also have Paul Koch, who is an extension turfgrass pathology specialist who also oversees the UW Turfgrass Diagnostic Lab. And we have Hannah Gaines-Day, a research scientist at UW-Madison's Department of Entomology. So thank you, PJ, Paul, and Hannah for joining us today. We're going to get started with some questions for each of you. And let's just get started with you, PJ. What can you tell us about what would make a healthy habitat for pollinators, or what do pollinators need?
Sure. And that's a really important question to understand, because if we're trying to help out pollinators, it's good to understand simply what their needs are. Now, if we distill it down into kind of the most basic elements, what pollinators need, generally speaking, is not all that different from what you and I need. You know, some really important things we need are stuff like food, moisture, shelter. Well, for bees and other pollinators, that's very similar. They need some of these resources to gather supplies for themselves or to provision nests for their young. So for pollinators, we're talking about materials such as pollen and nectar, which we know come from floral resources. Sometimes pollinators will go to other water sources as well, but in many cases they can get moisture directly from nectar from plants. So they need that, generally speaking. They're also going to need some shelter, but keep in mind with pollinators, often they can be fairly mobile. And so for some species, they might actually be nesting not in your yard directly. They might be in a neighbor's yard or down the block at a park or something like that. But they would need some sort of nesting habitat in the general area. Now, that was speaking broadly about pollinators. And as Julie had explained, there's a lot of different types of pollinators out there: bees and wasps and beetles and flies and moths and butterflies. And so if you look at those individually and you start looking at individual species, I won't dive into all the details, but each insect pollinator and other pollinator is going to have slightly different specifics in terms of what they need. They might uh, really like certain types of plants, for example. Other pollinators might be more of generalists and could go to a wider range of plants. So in general, you want to help out pollinators. You want flowering plants for nectar and pollen. But if you're trying to help out some very specific ones or help out a bunch, we probably want to have a greater diversity of plants out there, or include specific plants to provide resources for those specific pollinator species. So that's kind of a brief overview of what pollinators need. It's food, shelter, and those sorts of resources.
All right. Thanks, PJ. We're going to move on again, recalling what we heard from Julie in terms of just in general, what is the No Mow May initiative? How did it get started, and what is it really? And that leads to the question for you, Paul. What happens to my lawn if I don't mow it for a month? Other than it gets longer.
Yeah, I was gonna say it gets long, right? And so that's the first thing that happens. And so and how long it's going to grow is going to depend on a couple different things. One, the weather that we're having that particular May. If it's a warm May, you could have grass that's 8 inches or higher in certain cases, and especially grass that might be in a full sun situation. So that's grass that's pretty tall, and will be a little difficult to get back down to, whatever the normal expected height is. And so then the question is, what do we do once we hit that June 1st and we start to get the lawn back down to the normal height? Do we just kind of come in and whack it off all in one chunk, or do we sort of gradually bring it back down? For the most part, the lawn is relatively resilient. I think that's a more minor concern is how will the lawn respond? We do recommend going at a more gradual pace, kind of going at once a week or every other week, and kind of cutting it off in thirds. We call that the one third rule, never mowing off more than 1/3 of the height of the grass in a single mowing. If you violate that 1/3 rule, kind of once, it's not going to be a huge detriment. You just don't want to be doing that on a regular basis, because when you violate that 1/3 rule, or when you take off more than 1/3 of the height of the turf in a single mowing, you're really removing a tremendous amount of the green photosynthetic tissue, right? The parts of the plant that produce the energy for the plant to survive. And you're really getting down into the stemmy undercarriage of the plant that's not producing a lot of photosynthesis. So the turf really needs to sort of recalibrate, produce new green tissue so that it can start growing again. So if that happens once, again, not a real huge stress on the plant, but it certainly is a stress. The plants are going to use more water. They're going to use more energy to redevelop. So you're going to need to kind of watch out the health of the turf at that time of the year. But again, in most situations, the turf comes through that okay. Other things that we're also concerned about with that big significant mowing is the stress on the mowers, right? It's going to take a significant amount of gasoline and really sharp mower blades to really get through that thick, heavy turf. So we would recommend having a freshly sharpened mower blade to help you get through that taller grass when you go out there in early June. So those are some of the things that we think about when we think about the health of the lawn and how we can get it back. One other important thing to consider is that when you kind of violate that 1/3 rule, when you cut off a large portion of the turf, the plant has a hormonal response to grow faster. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you cut off a large portion of the grass, it's going to grow back faster than it did before. It's a defense response for the plant to produce more energy, but it means it's going to grow fast. So you're probably going to need to mow your yard more often for the first, 2, 3, 4 weeks that you start mowing again than you normally would expect because of the increased hormonal growth promotion that's been occurring in response to a removal of a large part of the tissue.
Great, thank you. So let's turn our attention back to the pollinators again. Hannah, could you talk to us about the No Mow May and the benefit of unmowed lawns? Is there any evidence that No Mow May supports pollinators or that pollinators benefit from an unmowed lawn?
Sure, great question. So any habitat that provides more flowers is going to be a benefit to pollinators. That being said, if your lawn is all grass with no flowers at all, not mowing for the month of May is not going to have any impact on pollinators. So if you're participating just to participate, but you have no flowers, the pollinators are not going to see a benefit. There is evidence that No Mow May can encourage pollinators and provide resources for pollinators. There are a number of studies, and also the last couple of years, Sun Prairie residents have been doing No Mow May practices. And last year we teamed up with them to do take some measurements in the lawns that were mowed and not mowed. And we found, it's a very small data set, but we found that lawns that were not mowed for the month of May had more flowers and more pollinators and more different kinds of pollinators. So that's a very preliminary data, but it is a nice evidence showing that there is a good trend for pollinators in these unmowed lawns.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see. Thinking also, kind of going back to you, Paul, now that with that idea of there is some evidence of a benefit to pollinators, of there being more diversity, more flowers in those unmowed lawns. Is there anything else that you would want to throw in there around what I might do to prepare going into May? If I want to participate in a No Mow May, what should I be thinking of as I'm moving into this springtime, if the snow melts sometime here soon? How can I prepare if I want to participate in No Mow May? You gave us some good things to think about already in terms of coming out of it, but is there anything I need to do to get ready to participate in No Mow May?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that No Mow May is so popular is that it's easy, right? You don't mow your lawn, you're doing something less, and you are potentially having some of these benefits. But as Hannah just talked about, unless you have those flowering plants, the benefit that you would provide to pollinators is relatively minimal. And so from a turfgrass specialist, I think what we try and relay to people who are interested in helping out pollinators through the lens of their yard is to be proactive and not just, take this month of not mowing and thinking that we've, saved the pollinators, but really to plant some species, be proactive in putting in species in your yard that are going to flower. And so there's clovers that do that. The University of Minnesota has done a great job in listing specific plant species that flower at a height that is under, that would flower at a height that most lawnmowers are at. And that's really what we want in pollinator-friendly lawns, or bee lawns, are species of plants that flower while the lawns are mowed. So it's a mixture of grasses along with these clovers and other flowering plants that flower at low heights. And so not necessarily something that you would do, like right now, but it's probably something you would do throughout the year to put these flowering plant species into your yard throughout the year, so that you're just increasing the amount of flowering plants in your yard and still retain its utility, right? That's something that's unique about turfgrass lawns, and something that a lot of people like about their turfgrass lawns. It's a space that you can use, right? It's not a flower bed. Lawns serve a different purpose. But if we can get some of those pollinator friendly benefits while also still retaining the use of our yard, whatever we use it for, I think that's especially beneficial. And again, rather than just not mowing your yard, going in there and really being proactive, choosing plants, interseeding those plants into your yard, and then allowing those to flower, and obviously not spray herbicides then that would remove those flowering plants from the yard is another important aspect. And I think that's what we've recommended, rather than just not mow, is to be proactive in putting in those plants that are going to flower and provide those pollinator benefits.
Excellent. Hannah, maybe you could build on that from your research and your experience. Do you have any plants in particular, any flowering plants that you could recommend that we put in our lawn? I know Paul mentioned a few things, and maybe some websites that we could go to find those resources. And I know, Julie, you probably have a few in mind that you've already put in, but let's think more about that idea of if we're not going to being more deliberate about what plant species are in our lawn, so that if we don't mow it in May, we can provide more benefit.
Yeah, so the Minnesota bee lawn that was mentioned previously, Julie just put the link in the chat. That's a really great resources for looking for flowers that you can put into your lawn that will grow at the level of the lawn that you can mow over, and it'll still provide resources. Clover is a really easy one. It's easy to find clover seed at the store. It's easy to seed it into your lawn. But the Minnesota bee lawn website has some more details on that. I also want to step back for a minute and say that I think that No Mow May is a great way to bring awareness to pollinators, and it's sort of a great first step. But if your goal is to provide resources for pollinators, there are probably better ways to do that. And if you go online to the Xerces Society in particular, they have lists of native flowering plants that will work really well in our system. And so I think prioritizing, if your main goal is to help pollinators, then looking at other plants you can plant around your garden and yard rather than in the lawn is probably going to have a bigger bang for your buck. Although No Mow May is a great way to sort of get started and a great way to bring publicity to the plight of pollinators.
So Peggy, if I can, just to kind of go off what Hannah talked about there, another thing that we talk about when we talk about No Mow May is kind of, why do you only care about pollinators for 1 month, right? Why do we stop caring about pollinators on June 1st? And so planting some of these other plants, I think, is a good way to extend the benefits to the pollinators. And the other thing that we talk about from a turfgrass perspective, being a turfgrass guy, is rather than not mow your yard for the entire month of May and then kind of chop it back down on June 1st, is just increase the mowing height of your yard the entire growing season, right? So if you increase that mowing height of your yard, to 2.5, 3.5 inches, that still is going to be under almost any ordinance from municipalities as far as mowing height. It's still going to look nice, might look a little shaggy for certain people's perspectives, but it will still retain its utility as a yard. And most flowering plants, probably only the tallest dandelions, will flower above a 3 or 3.5 inch mowing height. So you have benefits from that perspective, and then in addition, you get additional benefits to your grass as well. They're going to taller plants are going to grow deeper roots, so they're going to be naturally more drought resistant as well. So I think what we often recommend, aside from putting in being proactive and putting the plants in that will flower at a lower mowing height, also just increasing the mowing height of your yard and keeping that higher height of cut all year long provides pollinator benefits if there are flowering plants present, but it also provides benefits for the yard as well from a sustainability standpoint.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. I think that really leads nicely into a couple questions that we wanted you to address, PJ, around like Paul was just saying about the idea of being aware of more than just what we do in May. We can be aware of how we grow our turf or our lawns throughout the season. So PJ, around that idea, what could you tell us about the impacts of pesticides and the other chemicals that we might use on our lawns and their impacts on pollinators?
Sure, and there's a lot we could potentially talk about with that question, and I am very well aware that everyone is going to have a slightly different view on how they want their lawn and their yard to look. And so we're not here to tell you this is what you need to do. Rather, we want to give you some advice on how you can take your current lawn, and if you're concerned about pollinators, want to help them what you can do. And for some folks, they may want that really dense weed-free lawn. And as Paul and Hannah mentioned, there's some other things we can do in our yard. You could have a weed-free lawn and still support pollinators through lots of other flowering plants in your yard. But when it comes to home lawns, it is an area that commonly receives pesticide inputs, and that could be a lot of different things. So first of all, what's a pesticide? Well, it's basically a chemical substance used to kill or control or manage some sort of pest. That pest could be an insect. Those would be insecticides that impact insects. We can have herbicides that deal with weeds. We can have fungicides that deal with fungal diseases, and there's other types as well. Now, when you look at all these pesticides, it gets fairly complex because there's so many different chemicals that are used out there. If you break it down into some of the simplest terms, though, we can have some impacts that are direct and others that are more of an indirect route in terms of how they might impact pollinators. So a direct route would be you've got flowering weeds in your lawn, you apply some sort of maybe an insecticide, and it directly contacts those insects that are visiting, i.e. pollinators that are visiting those flowers, or maybe there's a residue there and the pollinators come by sometime later, and it has a direct impact on them. That might be very acute. It might kill them on the spot. In other cases, it might not be lethal. It could be a sublethal impact, but that could still impair them. And the overall impact is going to depend on the exact pollinator species. If you have something like a honeybee, honeybees have these large colonies, and if you lose a worker here, a worker there, and they're always losing workers as they just kind of naturally age out, so to speak. But if you have a colony of 5,000 or 10,000 honeybees and you lose 2 workers, that's a very small fraction of your workforce, so to speak. If you are a native solitary bee and you are the lone female doing all the work for your nest and you die, that's a very different impact. But again, with some of these pesticides, we can have a direct impact. We know some of the insecticides that are commonly used on lawns to control insect pests such as white grubs or chinch bugs or cutworms or sod webworm caterpillars. There are some groups of those insecticides that can be very acutely toxic. There's one particular group called the neonicotinoids that bees seem to be very sensitive to it. Some of the compounds in that group. Some of the other ones are pyrethroids. They don't persist as long, but they can still be acutely toxic if the insects are exposed to it. There's also that indirect route I mentioned. So you can have an herbicide that might not be directly toxic to pollinators, but if it's getting rid of weeds, flowering plants, that could have indirect impacts. There's also some cases where herbicides or fungicides might not be acutely toxic to bees or other pollinators, but they may have some sort of sublethal indirect effect. It might impact the gut microbes that they have inside their body. So there's that. And then one other aspect to this I want to mention is when you think about risk to pollinators, risk is really made up of 2 main components. One is toxicity of the chemicals. So how acutely toxic or kind of chronically toxic are those compounds, but also a big factor is exposure. And so you could, in theory, use a pesticide that might be acutely toxic to bees, but if you can apply it in a way or it has a short residual and bees or pollinators aren't going to be exposed to it, then we can greatly reduce the risk. So that's a consideration as well. Along those lines, I do want to, I'll put a link in here just momentarily when I stop talking. It's a fact sheet we wrote a couple years ago on dealing with conserving pollinators in managed turfgrass settings, so home lawns and things like that. Again, sometimes folks will use grub control products and other things, and there are ways to apply those, choosing maybe a granular rather than the liquid. Can we mow just before applying those and clip off those flower heads? There's some approaches like that that even though you use these products that may have some toxicity towards pollinators, we can greatly reduce the overall risk because we can minimize the exposure component. So I'll hand it back to you, Piggy, and I will in just a moment include a link to that fact sheet.
Thanks a lot, PJ. I wondered, this is really a complex issue and you really started getting at that. Hannah or Paul, do either of you have anything that you wanted to add before we go just a little bit different direction on this idea of the chemicals used in the lawn? PJ touched on a lot of the points. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Not for me. I think PJ did a great job summarizing the topic.
And I think I'll just add that a lot of times I think chemicals are used that aren't actually needed. And so really determining if you really need to use the chemical or not would be an important consideration as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Hannah. So then we're going to take this similar, related, but just a little different twist on this. PJ, we do get asked frequently about that longer unmowed grass, and if there are unintentional consequences that might be things like more mosquitoes in our yard or more ticks in our yard, if we are thinking again about No Mow May in particular, or even, Paul suggested that a best practice might be to always mow a little bit longer than what we're used to. From an insect entomology standpoint, PJ, are there unintended consequences, things that we might find that are negative to us?
Yeah, good question. And part of that is we don't know the full answer for some of these. Now, a couple of things you'd mentioned, like ticks and mosquitoes. Let's look at mosquitoes first. So mosquitoes, they're really developing in bodies of water, ponds, lakes, wetland, marshy areas, in urban, suburban areas where we have infrastructure such as rainwater catch basins. Some species really like to breed in those areas. So those are the sources. Mosquitoes obviously come into our yards. Sometimes they will rest in yards, but it's usually on vegetation such as dense shrubs, thicket type areas, things like that, rather than the turf grass. So in terms of elevating a turf grass height, mowing higher, I really wouldn't expect any major impact on mosquitoes. And I haven't seen any research suggesting something like that. So I really don't think it's going to impact the mosquitoes. There's much bigger factors at play with those in the landscape around you. In terms of ticks, that is a topic that we have a lot of research done on ticks, but it's still an evolving situation. And the thing I want to mention with that is related to our deer ticks. And that's probably the tick species that folks need to worry about the most in the state because of its connection with Lyme disease. And we really didn't detect our first deer tick in Wisconsin until about the late 1960s or so, where some of the first specimens picked up. So they went from just a few spots, late 60s, 1970s, to today being found in basically every county in the state. And so this is really an emerging health threat that has been going on in our lifetimes over the last 50, 60 or so years. With that said, because it's still relatively new, we don't know when or where this expansion will stop and what their range would be. We do know in some parts of the state where there's high tick pressure up towards like Eau Claire, for example, there are situations where folks have ticks even in their lawn type setting. Generally, a turfgrass lawn is not going to be great habitat for ticks. It's often kind of too open, too sunny, maybe not enough moisture. Ticks on a day-to-day, a big threat they face is desiccation. But I think this is something that folks should be aware of. If you live in an area where you are regularly seeing ticks, maybe you're in good tick habitat because your yard is surrounded by woods, and we know the ticks are usually coming from those places into a yard, then you might want to kind of think about that and factor that in with No Mow May. And if there's a concern that if we have higher mowing height in a case like that, maybe it's going to allow the ticks to come more into a yard. That might be a situation where we say, okay, let's not do this, but we could do other things in our yard, planting more flowering trees and shrubs and other types of flowers to still support pollinators while taking some steps to help minimize ticks because of the human health aspect. So There could be that negative aspect. Otherwise, in general, if you are having a higher grass height, you're probably on a kind of a microscopic level, increasing overall diversity. You've got more of an ecosystem in there. We know in a typical home lawn, there's a lot of insects that you could potentially find there. And if we have higher height of grass blades, we can have proportionally deeper roots, and that's just going to allow more little niches for these insects and other organisms to live in.
Well, great information there, PJ. That is a question that we get a lot, so I appreciate you covering that. Let's switch gears just a bit and come back to you, Hannah. Folks are oftentimes wondering as they look at their own lawn, like how it rates. Am I providing any habitat? And this will also lead into some of the questions that are coming in live from our attendees in terms of what is in their lawn, creeping Charlie, dandelions, violets. And so what can you tell us about tools that we might be able to use to determine how pollinator friendly our lawns or landscapes are?
Sure, yeah, we have an online pollinator habitat assessment tool that anyone can use. I think Julie maybe posted the link. If not, we can post it here in a minute in the chat. But it sort of is a worksheet that walks you through an assessment of your property to look at what you have in terms of flowers and flowers at different times of the year. And then it sort of gives you an overall score of how pollinator friendly your lawn is or your yard is. So that's one tool that's available to people to look at. There's both a PDF download, I think, and an online clickable version. And then another tool that we're working on is a smartphone app that we developed in our lab called WiBee. And WiBee is sort of a fancy timer that allows you to record pollinator visits to flowers. And this can be done in any type of habitat, on any flowering plant. This is a tool that we used with the No Mow May project in Sun Prairie, but anyone can use it. So that's a tool you can use to just look at how many pollinators are actually visiting. I think a lot of bees in particular are very small and you don't really notice them until you really stop and pay attention. And so WiBee sort of helps you to pause for a minute and do these observations. The WiBee is a 5-minute survey. And so you stand looking at a patch of flowers for 5 minutes and record all of the pollinators you see visiting. So I think the combination of the pollinator habitat assessment tool we have and WiBee would be a nice way for you to get an idea of what resources do you have in your lawn and what pollinators do you have out there.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to move into questions from our attendees that are kind of closely related to that. And before I do that, Paul or PJ, did you have anything else that you wanted to add? Well, then I'm going to dive into a question that in various shapes and forms has been in our Q&A box several times here. And it's about specific species in our grass and dandelions in particular. People always want to know about dandelions and there's been a lot of information out there about I'm letting my lawn grow, I'm letting the dandelions there for pollinators. And I think we get asked probably creeping Charlie and dandelions the most frequently. Are they really providing a benefit to pollinators? Is it kind of maybe an urban myth that if we let those weeds grow in our lawn, we're providing habitat or food or resources for pollinators? We're making our lawn more friendly for pollinators. So perhaps, I think if we could talk about dandelions and creeping Charlie in particular, if there's any research or if you know, perhaps Hannah, can you kick us off on that?
Sure. I mean, dandelions provide resources. You see bees nectaring on dandelions all the time. I think with any, thinking about our own diet, if you opened your fridge and all you had to eat was eggs, you wouldn't be the healthiest if all you ate was one thing. And so just like humans, bees need a diverse diet. And so dandelions could be part of that diverse diet. They don't want to only have dandelions because that won't provide all of the nutrients that they need to be healthy. But it certainly provides some resources for them. As far as creeping Charlie goes, I think creeping Charlie doesn't have either that much in terms of pollen and nectar for the bees. And what it does have is more inaccessible to a lot of the bees. Just the flower shape is not the best for most bees to get at. And so I would say Dandelion probably is providing more resources for bees, but again, that Minnesota Beon website has some lists of plants that are good pollinator plants as well.
Anything to add on that, anyone?
Yeah, I'll chime in here quick, Peggy. As Hannah mentioned, there can be value to some of these plants. It's one thing to have insects that will visit a flower, and then it's another question, how good is that flower for those insects? And sometimes that's a really difficult question to add, like how much pollen, could we weigh out a mass and things like that? How much pollen, how much nectar, what are the nutritional chemical profiles of those, and a lot of research is needed. There are some studies out there. I do want to mention one study by a colleague, Dr. Jonathan Larson. This was from his PhD work when he was at the University of Kentucky, and he looked at urban lawns in the area of generally Lexington, Kentucky or so, and they looked at dandelions and clover and assessed pollinators there. And just from those two plants, they spotted about 50 or more different species of pollinators. So as Hannah mentioned, you'll see bees on dandelions all the time, and they definitely can go in and utilize those plants to a certain extent.
Great, thanks. Julie, you've been monitoring our Q&A box as well. What would you like to pick out of the long list for us to talk about next?
I'm gonna point this next one to Paul about turfgrass and turfgrass care. And it says, I've heard that mowing ASAP in May once, and then waiting a while before the next mow, like waiting some weeks, is recommended by turfgrass experts as a good or better practice, and it leads to a thicker lawn throughout the season. What are your thoughts?
I've never heard that one. So I don't, I think potentially what that initial mowing would do is kind of remove maybe some initial like winter detritus or something in the system. But no, I haven't seen any data. I don't make that recommendation myself. I don't, the other turfgrass specialists that I work with, I don't know of that recommendation. So I don't think that there's really any benefit to doing kind of one early mowing and then letting it go. I would just, when the lawn is too long for your liking, I would just start the mowing whenever that process hits in a given year.
Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just reiterate, I think the recommendation is just to mow high throughout the season. Just keep it simple, mow high.
Yeah. I mean, again, so people that have different, the lawn is a lot of social constructs within a lawn, and people have different thoughts about what their lawn should be. So, I look at my job as helping people get the lawn they want, whatever that is. And so, if people want to have a sort of a very golf course like lawn, then we'll help them get to that. So, but from a resource usage and a water usage and a sustainability viewpoint, mowing high has a lot of benefits.
Great. And I'm going to keep it with you, Paul, because this one just kind of came in and just what we were talking about. We've heard of No Mow May, but I've also heard of maybe slow mow summer or some other alternative, phrases or kind of maybe even methods. I know we say, mow high, May, June, July. So are they kind of all saying the same thing, or how do they compare?
Yeah, I think they're all saying basically the same thing, just different marketing sayings, which are all great and much better than anything I could come up with. But yeah, I think they all are a variant of the same thing, which is that keeping your lawn at a higher height of cut will have a lot of benefits to the lawn and will, in many cases, allow you to use fewer inputs. By inputs, I mean water, irrigation, fertilizer, and pesticides to keep your lawn at the state that you want it in. So it's typically a very good practice to go. And we're not talking, 4, 5, 6 inches. Typically 2.5 to 3.5 inches is our recommended mowing height for most grass species that would grow in Wisconsin. So we would just recommend going at the higher end of that range, some 3.5 inches, somewhere around there. Could provide a lot of benefits for the health of the lawn. There's benefits for the health of pollinators if you have some of those flowering plants in your lawn. and you can use fewer resources.
Great. Thanks, Paul.
Mhm.
I'm going to switch to probably point this at Hannah or PJ, or both of you can chime in. We're getting a lot about mosquito treatments, whether maybe people are using them themselves or maybe a neighbor has been spraying. So how much effect does that have on pollinators or other insects in your landscape?
Yeah, really good question. And it's something that seems to be getting more common over the years. You drive through, the countryside or suburban home areas, and you see these yard signs for mosquito, Bob or Jim or someone was out there spraying for mosquitoes. Part of it is we don't fully understand all the impacts that can have. And one element is that there's not been a whole lot of research on those particular types of mosquito treatments. So splitting some finer hairs, there's different types of mosquito treatments. One which isn't used so much here in Wisconsin, it's used more to the south of us where it's warmer, kind of more year-long almost mosquito pressure, where they will use what are called ULV or ultra low volume treatments. This is where they use a very, very small volume of the actual pesticide. They use a special machine to get it into the air basically as a super fine fog. And you would do this during a period of time when mosquitoes are active. So typically the evening hours, humans are inside more, or it's done at night. So humans are inside, mosquitoes are out and about. We know from those treatments, impacts on like bees and pollinators are probably relatively low. When you look at the physics of those treatments, there's a component of body mass. And so mosquitoes, we know, have a small body mass. The droplets seem to impact them. But in general, if you are an insect with a larger body mass, it's not impacting you so much. Also, with these types of treatments, the droplets are a very fine, small size. They're only active for a short period of time and then they disperse. So think of it as a one-time strike against mosquitoes almost. But again, if you have a company come spray your yard for mosquitoes, that's usually not what they are doing. Instead, they're doing something called a barrier or residual yard treatment. What they do is they take a backpack sprayer or a pump spray or something like that, and they are spraying a pesticide onto the foliage of trees and shrubs. The idea is these are spots where mosquitoes are resting. If they land on a treated surface, that can impact them. But we know when you look at these products, and you can order a product to use for this purpose and look at the label, and you can take that same product and spray it on those plants to control Japanese beetles. And we know it'll protect from Japanese beetles for a couple of weeks. So there really hasn't been a whole lot of research. I'm aware of 2 papers I think I've seen. One was from Dr. Karen Oberhauser, looked at monarch caterpillars, and they did a simulated mosquito treatment to milkweed, put monarch caterpillars on there, and those monarch caterpillars were harmed or even killed 2-3 weeks after that treatment was done. I've seen another one involving honeybees. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done. But if you are having your yard treated like that regularly, say once a month, the shrubs and greenery in your yard, that's going to have a residual insecticide barrier on it. And so insects that land on there, pollinators or otherwise, could be impacted. That's things like fireflies, which often land on these plants. That could be pollinators. If you have a leaf cutter bee that is clipping off a portion of that leaf and taking it back to their nest and there's pesticide residue on it, that's not going to be good. But again, a lot more research is needed on that particular topic, but I think there's definitely some risks there, and that topic does not get enough attention.
Thanks, PJ. Hannah, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay, great. Peggy, what else do you have?
Well, I think kind of along those same lines of people just thinking more holistically about all the things they're doing in their yard and when they might be benefiting or doing something detrimental to pollinators. Someone has asked, is crabgrass preventer harmful to pollinators? And I know that's kind of on people's minds right now, even though there's snow on the ground today. We've been getting lots of questions about timing of crabgrass preventers. So when we're thinking about all the things we do in our yard, I think this might be you, Paul, that you could comment on crabgrass preventer.
Sure. So most of the common crabgrass preventers are used do not just prevent crabgrass. They are more, they prevent, a lot of the very common ones prevent germination of any seed. So if the flowering plant that you're interested in, like crabgrass itself doesn't provide really any usable pollen for pollinators that I'm aware of. But a lot of the common crabgrass preventers prevent germination of all seeds, including turfgrass. Actually, we come across this problem relatively regularly. If people apply a crabgrass pre-emergent product, then they want to seed some regular turfgrass into their lawn. A month later, it doesn't grow because the chemical is preventing germination of all seeds. So yeah, if you're using one of those products that is a non-selective germination inhibitor, then it's going to prevent the germination of flowering seeds if they're germinating from an annual seed, right? Plants that are already, perennial plants that are growing would not be affected by that. So I'm not aware of any, direct toxic impact from the herbicide chemicals on pollinators. Of course, there could be, but I think the bigger impact would be the prevention of the germination of any flowering plants that would be occurring due to the use of those products. So if you're concerned about that, there are certain selective germination inhibitor products, something like a mesotrione, which would, mesotrione wouldn't work because, and actually a selective product wouldn't work in this case anyways, because there are selective herbicides that we recommend if you want to just prevent crabgrass and other sort of weed species, but that would not prevent the germination of grass. So if you're trying to allow for the germination of flowering plants, those selective ones wouldn't work either. Kind of going through this process in my head here. So yeah, if you are concerned about the germination of flowering plants in the yard from from seed, then I would recommend not using any sort of crabgrass preventer product at all.
All right. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Well, I am going to take a question that is related to our No Mow May and what we're talking about. But I think that it's, even though it's only related, not real specific to No Mow May, we get this question so often about spring cleanup. And again, we want to think holistically about our yard and how we can be more friendly towards pollinators. So what about that spring cleanup or even the fall cleanup? What is the most, how can we balance maybe how we want our yard to look over the winter or early in the spring with the cleaning up? What are the things that we can do to be more pollinator friendly? Should we be cleaning every leaf out of our yard in the fall? Should we leave some places? Could anyone address that?
Sure, I think that actually all three of us probably have some different perspective on this. But there's a campaign, Leave the Leaves. And the idea with that, I think there are a couple of things. One is that the leaves are returning nutrients back to the lawn or the garden. And so that's one reason to do it. The other is that insects are overwintering in the leaves. And so by leaving them in place, you're letting the insects complete their life cycle. I think there are ways if you don't like the look of leaves on your lawn, for example, and you just want to move them, you could maybe put it back into garden beds rather than just leave it on the lawn. That would be one option. Or if you are happy leaving it on the lawn, you can just mow it in the springtime, and then it sort of just the nutrients go back into the lawn. As far as pollinators, what we're thinking about here is most likely the stem nesting bees. So about 10% of native bees in North America are stem nesting bees, meaning that the adult makes her nest in a hollow stem and lays her eggs in that stem. Most of these species have one generation a year, and so the baby bees are developing throughout the whole year. And so if the adult is active in the spring, she'll make her nest, lay her eggs. Those eggs will develop into pupa, larvae and pupae, and then they stay in that state until the next spring, and then they emerge as adults. And so what you want to do with the cleanup is thinking about, do you have plants in your yard that have hollow stems? And if so, leaving them long enough that the bees can emerge. So that's the main, I think, concern with pollinators. Xerces has a really nice handout about that. We can find the link and put it in the chat here in a minute. And then the other, I saw another comment somewhere in here, a question about pollinators and are you disturbing nesting pollinators when you're mowing the tall grass? So most native bees do live in the ground, but they aren't necessarily nesting in areas of dense grass. They would be nesting in more sparsely vegetated areas. So you shouldn't be disturbing a nest, most likely, with the tall grass. That's different from wasps like there are a lot of ground nesting wasps that are social, and if you run that over with a lawnmower, they all come and swarm out and sting you. The native bees that we're thinking of are solitary, and they're not going to do that.
Thanks, Hannah.
Just to, I mean, from a turf perspective, so we actually have a USDA funded study looking at many things, but one of them is the impact of mulching the tree leaves into your lawn. So we are just wrapped up year 2 of this study, and what we found from this, and again, this is not necessarily related to pollinators, but it kind of provides the turf perspective to what Hannah just talked about. And that is, if you just leave the tree leaves on your lawn, you don't do anything to them, you can have some significant smothering if it's smothering damage over the winter if it's covering the lawn completely. So what we recommend, what we found from our study, is to just go over them with a lawnmower and chop those tree leaves up. And as long as you can see the turfgrass leaf blades coming through the chopped up tree leaves, the turf should survive fine. And you kind of get the best of all these worlds, where you still are retaining the nutrients from the tree leaves in the yard, which can provide nutrients, add organic matter to the soil, but you're not having the damage if you do nothing at all to those leaves. And I think it probably would also provide some of the habitat that Hannah described as well. So we have a study, again, it's a 4-year study, kind of looking at the long-term impacts of mulching tree leaves into the yard and the impacts on soil health and all these other sorts of issues. But one thing we've clearly seen is that if you have tree leaves on top of the grass and you can't see any grass coming through, there is significant smothering damage to the lawn, and it takes a significant period of time for the grass to recover in the spring.
Thanks, Paul. We're getting a lot of questions in about particular products or certain treatments or certain chemicals. So I'm going to kind of group those together. When people have questions about, well, is this product harmful to pollinators, or what do I do with this certain product? I'm going to say a couple of recommendations, I think, and I invite our panelists to also comment. But one is to read the label. Always read the label with any product. Actually, first step is to identify the problem and make sure it's something that you need to do something about, and identify it, and we can help you with that. But sometimes you don't have to do anything, or you're treating something that, with the wrong product. So really identifying the problem. If you do end up with some sort of product, reading the label, and everything on that label you need to follow: application, storage, mixture instructions, all of that. And I did put a link to the National Pesticide Information Center. I understand that link is not working right now, but that is a resource that you can look up the active ingredient in that label from that product that you choose, and you can see what other maybe side effects there are. So I would encourage people to do a little bit of research before you just reach for a spray or reach for a chemical or reach for a product. If you're hiring a service, ask what they're using, ask what they're treating for, what's the problem, what are they treating for, and what are they using, and really starting with some research and asking those questions. PJ, Hannah, Paul, with chemicals, and people are wondering, is this harmful, is that harmful, what kind of recommendations can you make?
I mean, I think the most simple one is the one you just said, Julie, and that is to read the label. If a product has been, there's extensive testing that is done for any pesticide before it comes onto the market, and one of those tests is for harm to pollinators. And so, if a product has been determined to be acutely toxic to pollinators, it will have to be labeled as such. And so it will have a bee icon, and in the environmental hazard section of the label, it will state, do not apply this product to areas where bees are foraging or pollinators are foraging. So it would actually be illegal then to apply that particular product to an area where bees are actively foraging. So reading the label, looking in particular at the environmental hazard section of the label, looking for that bee icon, and then being very careful with the use of those products, or just avoiding those products altogether, is a good way to make sure that you're not harming pollinators with the products that you're using.
And I'll jump in here briefly, and I'm going to put a bulletin in the chat that I'm rather fond of. This is a good publication from some of the states in the Pacific Northwest, and it deals with reducing bee poisonings from pesticides. Now, keep in mind, it's focused on bees such as honeybees, But that particular document is fairly lengthy, and there is a color-coded table in there which focuses mostly on insecticides. And it will tell you if that ingredient is acutely toxic to bees, is it kind of moderately toxic, is it relatively non-toxic. Keep in mind, again, you got to read the label. Paul and Julie mentioned that bee box, although that's generally going to be found on products that we know are really highly toxic to bees. There's other ones that can still be acutely toxic to bees, but they may not have that particular icon on it. So you really have to go through and read that full label.
Right. Well, we are down to our final minutes. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. And we would like your feedback. So Julie is going to put a link into the chat box with our extension evaluation survey for today's session. But before we wrap up, I want to come back to each of our panelists and just see if there's anything that you would like to add along with what we have already talked about today. What else could someone do to make their yard or landscape more pollinator friendly? Kind of your final thoughts on what we could each be thinking about or doing to make our yards and landscapes more pollinator friendly. Paul, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, I don't have anything new. I think we've covered a lot of things here. What I'll just re-emphasize is to create a plan and be proactive about how you're going to promote pollinator health in your yard and in your landscape as a whole, right? So whether that's adding in more flowering plants, whether that's adding in specific native species to the surrounding flower beds and those sorts of things. I think that's much more effective at promoting a healthy pollinator landscape than just not mowing your yard for 1 month.
Thanks.
Peggy, a couple of thoughts from me, and we've discussed this a little bit today, but just the idea of it's not just the month of May. When you think about all the pollinators Julie mentioned, we've got bees and we've got 400 or 500 species of those in the state alone. There's all the beneficial pollinator flies and wasps and moths and butterflies. And so we're really talking about thousands of different insect pollinators in the state. Those each differ in their biology, their phenology in terms of when they're out. And so ideally, we would want to maximize the number of flowering plants and resources throughout the growing season. As Hannah mentioned, sometimes certain species will come out and they've got one generation per year, and they might be out in mid-April to mid-May, and that's it. And then we won't see them again to the next year. And so if you've got a gazillion flowers blooming in August, that's awesome, but those early season ones are missing it. So ideal if you could have a bunch of different plants flowering throughout the entire growing season, then we're offering more items at the buffet, so to speak.
Thanks, PJ. And Hannah, any final thoughts?
I'll just add that the one biggest thing that anyone can do to help pollinators is plant flowers, whether that's a flower box or a pot on your front step or a huge garden. Any way that you can provide flowers is going to benefit the pollinators.
All right. Well, again, I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Paul Koch, PJ Liesch, and Hannah Gaines-Day. And of course, I want to thank my co-moderator and presenter, Julie Hill, who makes it a pleasure every day for me to work in Extension Horticulture programs. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And thank you all as our panelists and co-moderator. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.